Welcome to Liberty Lounge. I'm Max Stenner, and here is my co-host, Samuel Turner.
Hello.
Our first guest today is Patrick O'Flynn, who is a former member of the European Parliament for UKIP from 2014 to 2019, and is now a member of the SDP. Our second guest is Matthew Murphy, who is a friend of Liberty Lounge and is the SDP's candidate for Kettering in the next election.
Big up Kettering. Kettering forever.
Yeah, Patrick, Matthew, thank you for joining. Last week had some quite big news in the polls. According to YouGov, I found it quite hard to believe this when I saw it. But yeah, Reform UK on 15%, Conservatives only on 19%. Of course, this is just one poll, but it's quite a significant poll. And I think, Patrick, you've written about how you said it would be a mistake to believe that this is rock bottom, or like 20% is rock bottom for the Conservatives. So why do you think Reform UK is doing so well, and what do you think is the main appeal of the party at the moment?
Well, look, I think the Conservative Party is sort of stuck in almost a Blairite political paradigm where it's being run and Rishi Sunak's being advised by people who were spooked and defeated by Tony Blair back in the day in a completely different political and economic context. And they're basically always lean to a Blairite solution when the world has moved on since then. And, living standards have been static since the banking crisis. We've had the most enormous, uncontrolled mass immigration, which has put social cohesion under pressure, has probably been partly responsible for productivity being zero growth because there's no incentive to invest. Our public realm is more and more unpleasant, noticeably so. Our public services capacity is under strain. Life is getting worse. I think both private living standards and what I sort of refer to as the social living standard are in drastic decline. The whole paradigm has failed, and yet Rishi Sunak bottled it in terms of representing this feeling that the nation state needs to reassert itself, not just on illegal immigration, but also on the level of legal immigration, also on social solidarity and common British values. There's a huge space, on the right that Rishi Sunak walked away from, principally just after the Conservative conference where his speech bombed and he was doing nerdling little things about smoking or two or three other sort of third order priorities were the mainstay of his speech. And then after that, he panicked. He sacked Suella Braverman and he brought back David Cameron and sent a big signal to socially conservative, culturally conservative voters. It was a two-fingered signal, basically. And I note that at the time Rishi Sunak became Prime Minister, Reform UK was on less than 4%. Now it's averaging more than 12%. And most of that growth has come since the cabinet reshuffle, since Suella Braverman then went on to expose him as lacking nerve, both on stopping the boats and also lacking all interest in controlling the level of legal migration. And, he came out into Downing Street a few weeks ago, suddenly rattled by extremism and Islamism. Again, Suella Braverman, who's often portrayed as a bit of a nutter by the polite media, has been ahead of the game and proven correct on that as well. So I think there's just a massive signal gone out to particularly those sort of red wall working class older social conservatives that this guy is not for you. He's not going to address any of the fundamental issues you care about. Neither is his party. And that has all just fueled Reform UK without it having to try particularly hard. And I would say it has a less well worked out policy prospectus than, for instance, the SDP, but it is the brand that has got the Farage endorsement, that has kind of got carrying on the thread from UKIP to the Brexit Party, and so it has kind of first refusal as being the insurgent force, and it's in an ideal context. Arguably it should be doing even better.
I just out of curiosity, do you think Richard Tice's leadership has anything to do with their increase in the polls, or is it purely just dissatisfied Tories jumping ship, would you say?
Well, as the party leader, you know, if he was actively repelling the sort of voter groups that they might get, then that they wouldn't have risen, would they? And I also do give him great credit for, you know, doing the quote, the hard yards, when, you know, it was all sort of laughed off as a bit of an irrelevance. You know, Brexit had, quote, got done. There didn't seem to be the space there. He kept going, and he kept this thing ticking over and eventually starting to tick up. You know, is he a communicator of the caliber of Farage? Is he compelling like that? I don't think he is. He possibly wouldn't claim to be, but he's been quite plausible at setting out a whole bunch of values and policy positions. You know, net zero carbon being another one where he's, you know, against the prevailing consensus in Westminster. So he's been plausible. He's kept the show on the road. Other people are coming to the fore now. Ben Habib, the deputy leader, is probably a more compelling communicator too. But I think he does deserve a measure of credit. But really, the thing everyone's waiting for is Nigel Farage to jump back in.
Yeah, so people aren't considering voting reform because they're, you know, they want to cut taxes and they want to shrink the state.
I think there's a little bit of traction now for tax reduction and cutting of waste in public services. I don't see it as a main driver of votes, you know. And I was telling Richard Tice, you know, 3 or 4 years ago, immigration should be your number one issue that you should seek to own. You know, the gallop towards net zero, irrespective of the cost, is certainly something that's coming up on the rails, but probably the election after next. And, you know, the number of people, you know, who were, you know, being compelled to vote because of wanting tax cuts, I thought was quite small. I think since, you know, the frozen thresholds have really started to bite, there's a little bit more traction in that among some of the more recent recruits that Reform has got from the Tories. But I would say it's probably issue number 5 or 6.
Yeah, that's quite interesting, and I agree that their policies are not quite as detailed or thought out as the SDP. I mean, we interviewed a Reform candidate the other day, and he couldn't tell us the housing policy that they had. But yeah, Matthew, what do you think about what Patrick said? Do you think that immigration should be the number one issue for a party, whether Reform or UK, that wants to replace the Tories?
It should definitely be very high up there. Possibly number one. I wouldn't say it absolutely must be number one, but it is. I mean, for me, it's a huge issue, and for me, it's a near number one. I'd probably put it maybe tied number one with something like housing, for example, or nationalising public services. Are all very big issues for me. But immigration, the thing is, because especially with housing, which I think should be, if not number one, almost number one, a lot of problems with housing are kind of caused by mass immigration. Not entirely, but very significantly. So should immigration be number one? Maybe not, but things that should be number one are directly impacted by immigration. So to sort them out, you kind of have to sort immigration out. So it's like a symbiotic thing, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see what you mean in terms of you know, things like the welfare state and public services. Yeah, the argument is that if you want to maintain these things, you need a type of protection, and also, you know, for a national community to exist, you need cultural protection. So then yeah, the next question was what for Patrick is what direction is the British right heading in post general election? Are you thinking more a right-wing split or a Reform takeover?
It depends, I think, very much on just how badly the Conservatives do. I think, you know, the kind of studies that I've looked at, mainly from sort of amateur psephologists and people who look through Tory candidate lists, suggests that if the Tories come back with a sort of 1997 type landslide defeat with 150, 160 MPs, that will nudge their parliamentary party a bit to the left. You know, you'll lose the 50 odd red wall seats, which are pretty marginal and tend to have more social, national, conservative mood music from the MPs, and you'll have more, you know, of your Hampshire set MPs hanging on, and that will mean the Conservatives are not really credible representatives of any project to bring back sovereignty to the nation state over issues such as border control, you know, asylum systems, integration policies, citizen preference in public services, including social housing, you know, all the things that I think have got the real oomph and energy on the kind of social conservative right, will obviously be beyond the Conservative Party being able to advance or represent. And I think in those circumstances, there really is the possibility of reform kind of eating their lunch. And I think there's the possibility now of reform winning some MPs. If that YouGov polling is part of a trend, and that poll you referred to earlier suggested that the reform's actually ahead of the Conservatives among men in general, but also in the north of England in general. Now, if they're ahead in the north of England in general, they're likely to be well ahead of the Conservatives in most red wall seats, which is where they've been strongest. You know, the two Barnsley seats and Hartlepool, for instance, even in the 2019 election, when the Brexit Party got squeezed right down by Boris, they still performed very well there. So if they can get together an argument that a Tory vote is a wasted vote here, it's either us or Labour, are red wall voters champing at the bit to be represented by star-right Labour MPs? I don't think so. So I think there's a possibility of reform coming back with some MPs. That would open the door to a possibility of the sort of national conservative remnants who've got back under the Tory banner, the sort of Danny Kruger set, however many are left, John Hayes, one or two others in Lincolnshire way, some kind of merger or alliance there. But, you know, that would be easier still if the Tories get crushed right down, you know, to a, you know, the Labour election result. And I think it was 1931 when they came out with 52 MPs. You know, if the Tories get crushed down to that sort of level and Reform have, you know, Farage standing and winning in Clacton, maybe Tice wins Hartlepool, they might win one or both of the Barnsley seats, and then others across the red wall. If they've got 6, 8, 10 seats, that will be seen as them being the dynamic new offer, which embraces and covers all of these totemic issues. And the Tories then are represented in Parliament by your Tobias Ellwood type people, Penny Mordaunt and Gillian Keegan, no doubt coming back. Then I think Reform has a chance of really displacing the Conservatives altogether. My worry is that the Conservatives will come back, still be the official opposition, show a little bit of ankle on these issues. You know, in opposition, it's easier to imply you would grasp nettles when we've seen that Rishi Sunak won't grasp nettles, and be plausible again. And then second in the polls, Labour get unpopular very quickly because of the first order problems they can't solve. And then it's business as usual with the Conservatives v Labour hogging the media coverage. And it's very difficult for Reform to displace them. I think ever such a lot depends on Farage coming back and standing and leading into this election that's coming, and delivering something that exceeds expectations of Reform. And then I think the underlying support for the Conservative Party is extremely small. The only plausible reason to vote Tory for most people would be if they stand a chance of keeping Labour out of power. Once that's gone, and you have to ask the question, how much do I like these guys? Then I think their support, you know, drops through the floor.
What I'd say is that I believe wholeheartedly that if Farage comes back, that Reform could be the official opposition after the next election. Because Farage is very popular among Tories, even though he's never been a Tory politician. He said himself that I would be very surprised if I wasn't the Tory leader by 2026. And
yeah, I think that was sort of tongue in cheek, stirring the pot, but carry on.
But honestly, if he was to join the Conservative Party and get selected for a seat, I think he'd probably win it. And I think he could rise to be the leader of the Conservative Party before 2026. I think that is incredible. That's completely plausible. But I don't think he'll do that.
No.
Nigel Farage is such an influential figure in politics. And I think it shows that people don't vote for reform because they're reform. They vote because it's Nigel Farage. Like, people stopped voting for UKIP after Nigel Farage left and stopped being the leader because it was Nigel Farage that people liked. Without Nigel Farage, people didn't see a reason to vote UKIP, which is why...
If I could just jump in there, I do think also you need to know that Nigel Farage is very skillful at knowing when to... if you like, he's like a sailor who reads the winds. He's very skillful at knowing when to set sail and then when to wait in the harbour and let somebody else take unpromising seas. So, you know, for instance, the 2014 European elections, the 2015 general election, you know, UKIP was really standing for something. By the time we got to 2017, it looked like Theresa May was Brexit means Brexit. You know, and again in 2019, when Nigel did lead the Brexit party, Boris Johnson seemed to be a very authentic Brexiteer at that particular time, and the Brexit party in the end stood aside against Tories and got, you know, a fairly crushed share of the vote. So he's not quite a miracle worker. He's very good at deciding when things are so unpromising, he'll almost put a seat warmer in the role, which is probably what Richard Tice has been doing for the last 3 or 4 years. But now the weather has changed and the winds are good. Now Nigel can go and make money covering the American election and not really engaging in the UK one. But I think if he does that, it damages his brand with most of the people who like him in Britain, who see themselves being very patriotic and would think that saving Britain, because Nigel has said the Conservatives are destroying it, should be more his priority than going to make money standing next to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think it is possible to overestimate the Farage fact. I mean, you said that he's a very good political communicator, probably the best on the right. But you know, the effect of defections is also quite big. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that just after Lee Anderson defects, Reform are all in the news. They go up in the polls, and I'd be surprised if there aren't more defections, considering that a lot of the MPs that are going to lose their seats are in the red wall and are more culturally conservative ones, like Miriam Cates. So I think that's an interesting factor, and also the fact that among northern and working class, Reform are above the Conservatives. So there could be a tipping point in the future if the polls narrow between them. But Matthew Murphy, what did you think about?
Yeah, I just wanted to speak about. Max said that he could see Reform being the opposition after the next election. I think that's very unrealistic. I think much like in 2019, Reform were spoilers for red Brexit voters. They spoiled the Labour vote so that the Tories could get their supermajority. This time around, it's going to be in reverse. I think Reform are going to be spoilers for cultural conservatives that's going to allow Labour to get their supermajority. Reform might pick up 2 or 3 seats. They're not going to be leaders of the opposition. We're not going to see Farage and Starmer like debating across the House of Commons. It's not going to be like that. And I think it's as much as I'd like it to be like that, I just think it's unrealistic. I think they're mostly just going to spoil the votes of Tory candidates.
I kind of think that there's another thing reinforcing that, which is when you get to the media coverage, the national media coverage of a general election, they'll be looking at about, however many there are left, about 340 Tory, either incumbent MPs or new candidates for the seats the Tories won in 2019. And then they'll be looking at Labour, who've been the official opposition and are bestriding the polls well ahead. And nearly all the television media coverage will also be based on the last two general election results, the allocation of time. So many people are not as interested in politics as we all are, and don't sort of comb through podcasts. And, there's a line in Tony Blair's autobiography about the average person thinks about politics for maybe a minute a week, while they're eating their dinner one night. And they are going to, a lot of them they will have a tendency to fall under the supposition this is a binary race, which is very much the line that Conservatives will push. Only we can stop Keir Starmer. In a month's time, one of these two guys is going to be Prime Minister, Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak. And it's very hard for smaller parties to get a share of that attention. Now, Nigel Farage is brilliant at getting more than his fair share of attention, but even so, that's a formidable hurdle. We would need to see polls before the actual election period showing Reform has overtaken, for instance, the Tories in a poll. Then I think you could have a House of Cards effect. You could have some Red Wall MPs deciding to fight as Reform, against Rishi Sunak rather than for him, will give them a better chance. But if we go into the election period with the Tories still in some kind of second place, then that squeeze does start to bite quite hard. If that's not a mixed metaphor, the crush of the smaller parties because of the volume of media coverage is something that's hard to fight against.
Yeah, I think that is the unfortunate case with our first past the post system, and it is very interesting that it is only the smaller parties that want a more proportional system. So, but if you're looking, so after general election, you think it might be more of an even split, or more of a one party
in terms of MPs?
Yeah.
I mean, I tend to think, how the next few months goes is very important. I kind of think a lot of Conservative voters from 2019 will either sit on their hands and not vote, or will vote for Reform. How many Reform get across the line as MPs, I'm not sure. The risk is, as Matthew was saying, that the main impact is to give Labour a super majority. I actually think, from a point of view of someone who wants to see a sort of national social conservative, cultural conservative, pro-nation state force on the right of centre, I actually think an absolute mega landslide Labour government, even with the Lib Dems as the official opposition, would be no bad thing, because I think the volume of people out there in the country who would be enraged by that and looking for a new outlet would change things incredibly quickly. And I think the right could roar back, because Labour aren't going to tackle woke extremism. They're not going to stand up to Islamism. They're not going to tackle the abuse of the asylum system by irregular migrants. They're not going to meaningfully reduce legal immigration. They're going to make all kinds of concessions to weird ID politics, people who hate Britain, and there's going to be a mega opportunity on the right. And if the Tory Blairites have been swept away, then I think the chances of something emerging that can actually win in 2028, 2029, that has more of the agenda that I hope to see, are much more enhanced compared to the Tories coming back with 160 MPs and pretending to be a bit kind of nationally orientated, and then it's just into the far future. It's a kind of Blairite paradigm that just continues.
Yeah, and the only downside is 5 years of Starmer.
Yeah, but how much worse would Starmer be than Sunak and the Tories have been.
Yeah, I think I agree somewhat with that, and that I think it's the Peter Hitchens stance that if you want a Conservative government, you need to vote against the Conservatives. But yeah, I mean, moving on to the next topic. I mean, this month's been quite a horrific. There's been quite a horrific story coming out of Moscow with the concert shootings. This, of course, following on from the unprecedented terror attack in Israel last year. What more do you think can be done to fight against Islamist extremism in the UK and abroad as well?
Well, I mean, I think you're right to cite the October 7th attack. I mean, a lot of people see it as, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but in fact, Hamas are, a down the line ideological Islamist death cult. So it was absolutely a standard Islamist attack, of incredible ferocity and brutality. And yeah, so we've seen now this ISIS-K, ISKP, whatever name they get given, who carried out the Moscow mass murder, are mainly based in Afghanistan now, which is, winds the clock back more than 20 years to 2001 and Al Qaeda, and the attack on America. We have the Taliban back in charge in Afghanistan, and we have, this Islamist terror group that wants to export terror, setting up camp there. So, so much Western blood and treasure was spent achieving precisely nothing. So the geopolitics of tackling Islamism abroad are very, very difficult. And then we turn to the domestic situation, and we in the last 5 years or so, we've had a huge extra influx of Muslim immigration from North Africa, the Middle East, chain migration from Pakistan and Bangladesh, into already poorly integrated communities here. And we're seeing, more and more aggressive demands for, we have now a de facto Islamic blasphemy law based on fear. And, people talk about the Batley teacher, but they also look abroad in France at teachers who've been killed for showing an image of the Prophet Muhammad, or the Charlie Hebdo killings. And so when anyone in British public life or in public services does something that upsets Islamists, what's standing behind the Islamist complaints, or the complaints of more mainstream Muslims, is this fear factor, this fear of being killed. And that's no doubt why you get all kinds of alternative comedians live at the Apollo taking the mickey out of Christianity, but never anything to insult Islam. I mean, who would do that? So we have this sort of new norm, really, that freedom of speech may not formally have been abandoned in this context, but in reality it has been. It's gone. And we then have seen post October the 7th that there were massive celebrations in parts of London. There was a big protest outside the Israeli embassy London embassy, a couple of days after the October the 7th attack, before Israel had even responded militarily at all. It's really shocking to see British residents, if not potentially British citizens, celebrating this massacre of mainly Jewish people in Israel, and being so motivated by a foreign conflict, that they returned, for instance, George Galloway in Rochdale, who said this is for Palestine. So we have communities who I think may not be full of extremists, but extremists, fundamentalists, seem to be able to dictate the agenda and kind of imply to the wider Muslim community, you have to support us or you're not proper Muslims. you know, and then we have all kinds of other kind of social pathologies around female emancipation being, you know, sort of imaginary in many ghettoized communities in this country. You know, girls haven't got sexual self-determination. There's arranged marriages, forced marriages, first cousin marriages in cities like Bradford. You know, nearly half the sort of diaspora of Pakistanis are marrying first cousins from Pakistan in order to facilitate more immigration, and it runs totally against integration. So I think the average British person, particularly working class voters who may live cheek by jowl but with some of these communities, are extremely worried by the path that we're on and want to see much more muscular integration demands, want to see police and other agencies really stand up to this militancy. You know, and Suella Braverman, for all her flaws as Home Secretary, stood up for that wave of public opinion. You know, was sacked by Rishi Sunak. You know, and then 3 or 4 months down the line, he stands in front of Number 10, basically saying, "Oh yeah, what she said." So I do think that it's an integration challenge which is several leagues higher than any of the other integration challenges that British society faces in the era of identity politics. But I'm afraid that I think there's a latent feeling now among a broader section of the British public. You know, is it Islamists, or is it something to do, you know, inherent in Islam itself that's incompatible with pluralistic democracy? I think the public are feeling incredibly unsettled, worried, and looking for much firmer leadership than they're getting from any of the leaders of the parliamentary parties.
I think the big issue with radical Islam is that it's enabled by political progressives who take the idea of being welcoming as their number one moral. But the truth is, if you welcome everyone, you end up welcoming extremists. And if you end up welcoming extremists, you end up welcoming no one, as they push their extremist values.
Yeah, I'd like to speak on something regarding this, and it's purely anecdotal, mind. So, for all I know, my experiences are just completely different from what's actually happening. But from what I've seen, usually the people who immigrate from these Muslim countries, the actual immigrants themselves are generally actually quite more secular. It's the second generation. The second generation become very, very radical, and it's very interesting. That something I've noticed, and there's this TikTok I've seen, this viral TikTok. I don't use TikTok, but a friend of mine who does showed me, and it's this guy, and he's his parents are Turkish immigrants, and his parents are like full on secularist, like Kemalist. You know, they have like it's like during Christmas time, and they've got like statues like Father Christmas up and stuff like that. But this guy who's their son is like ranting about it. He's like, "Oh, you know, this isn't halal," and he's like shouting about like how we need like Sharia law and stuff. His parents, they haven't put that on him. They're secularists. So there's something going wrong in the education of the children of immigrants that's going on there, and I'm suspicious of what could be causing that. But from my experience, and again, like going to uni and stuff, I'm a university student right now. The people who are first generation immigrants or the foreign students, they're actually pretty normal. It's the children of first generation immigrants that are the radicals.
If I can pick up something that Max said about this alliance of the radical left with the Islamists, the sort of woke Islamist alliance that you see played out on the streets of London every Saturday, really, in these big demos. I do think it's true that if the radical Islamists in this country were posh white blokes like David Cameron and George Osborne, who'd all gone to Eton, the left would be really up in arms against them and saying it's a disgrace, you're privileged, you're blocking women's rights, you're regressive, you're reactionary. It's just, you know, the radical left does this thing where they have a kind of oppression binary, and if you can claim to to tick a few boxes of a group that's not powerful or rich in society or privileged in society. They'll seem to overlook any appalling beliefs, and so there is this alliance at the moment. And the fastest growing demographic in the country among young people obviously is Islam. We're also getting non-Islamic prisoners being kind of cajoled and bullied into signing up as a bit of a protection racket. I think the radical left will look back in a few years and regret what's happened, if we carry on down this path just as much as anyone else does.
Yeah, and the ironic thing is that the liberal left will be the first to be targeted if these groups had their way, if they came to power. Ban the woke flag and all of that stuff. Yeah.
Yes.
But yes, I see your point that we need more like strong assimilation. But going back to Matthew's anecdote, I think a lot of it is online radicalizations. Young people on their phones, they follow these like radical hate preachers. So that's obviously a big issue, but also this kind of victim culture and this idea that this romanticism of groups like Hamas, basically, who are seen as just like non-white revolutionaries. If Hamas was white European, they'd be seen as like neo-Nazis, basically. So I think identity politics, multiculturalism are big issues in this country, but I think we're also extremely naive if we think we won't be attacked by groups like Hamas, like ISIS-K, and we should probably also cooperate with foreign governments in Pakistan, India, and Africa as well, in fighting these groups. A lot of the funding comes from abroad, and a lot of their recruits as well come to this country from abroad, from places like Libya. So I think it's a big challenge, but it's something we're not really willing to talk about as a society, and talking about it might be the hardest part. So yeah, so what are your thoughts on the issue as a whole, and do you think we're ever going to end up in a situation where we can talk about it honestly without being cancelled, like Lee Anderson or Suella Braverman?
Well, I think that's another issue which obviously helped reform, by the way, the circumstances in which Lee Anderson left, because of sort of a politically correct response, an over-the-top response of the Conservative Party. So you want to know, do I think that we'll get to a better place? Well, I think there is potential. I mean, it concerns me what Matthew said about the younger generation are more radicalized than the parents. I mean, traditionally, I used to live and work in Birmingham a long time ago, we had the first sort of hints there of big trouble. And obviously, the first really big thing was the Salman Rushdie satanic verses fatwa, and the really big demonstrations in cities like Bradford and Birmingham. And I remember actually when I was working on the Hull Daily Mail in East Yorkshire, going to our favourite curry house, and we knew the waiters and had a good laugh with them normally. And the Rushdie thing had just happened. And one of the waiters, Jimmy, said if he was walking past now, I would grab one of these knives and kill him. You can't insult the Prophet. And that's when I thought, right, well, this is a reasonable guy in most of his guises. So we do have a problem here. We have a problem of not shared norms. And what you saw then was the British public realm not standing up and saying we're nipping this in the bud. No, in this country there is no blasphemy law. You had generally Labour MPs, even like Roy Hattersley, who was a noted author himself, who wouldn't fully stand up for Salman Rushdie, and the rot kind of set in from there. I think that there's coming a time when there will be enormous electoral pressure on the establishment parties to take a firmer line. But again, it might need something like reform to start getting MPs and surging in the polls before we get that level of rigor, because it's obviously the Conservative Party seems to be full of political cowards. They still haven't, to my satisfaction, ruled out having a definition of Islamophobia that protects the belief system from scrutiny rather than protecting individual Muslim citizens from persecution. I think the establishment parties in general are a long way from the centre of public opinion, as you see it among normal people. I don't know how it's going to play out. My fear is that we must be due some more Islamist terror attacks. Obviously MI5 has got pretty good at forestalling them, and we've had a fairly lucky run. I just fear it's coming to an end in a more sour environment where millions of people who'd see themselves as quite centrist voters are really ready to support a much more rigorous pushback.
Yeah, and hopefully, I hope things don't get as bad as Northern Ireland with sectarian violence, but yeah, it
Well,
would be
that's certainly the on an ultra long scale view. If you bring in a non-integrated community, and it grows in substantial numbers, and you get ghettoized cities with two communities with radically different values, you are going to end up with sectarian violence. Now, I think we've got a long way in which we can integrate and brush the harsh edges off people and hope to forestall that. But if we just carry on for the next 30 years, then that's how it went awry in Ireland, all those centuries ago.
Yeah, and I suppose some people argue that it could have been, the troubles could have been prevented in Northern Ireland if there'd been more bridge building at that time. So yeah, I think it's easy to feel quite hopeless about these issues, but it's also important to think positive and think more about integration and bridge building and building a British identity and focusing more on those British values. But yes, I mean, the next topic we were going to move on to was
Could I just say something really quick, if that's okay?
Yeah.
About this, I think from what I've been able to see and from what I know about that time period, which obviously I wasn't alive for, I think Islamism in this country is going a very similar path as National Front in the 80s. I think it's almost like a reverse National Front in that they were opposing immigrants, was this the other way around. But I think there's a very, very loud minority of these people, and I think they're going to get more and more radical. And I don't know what's going to happen, but I think it's going to peak at the same level as the National Front did. I don't think they're ever going to actually make real inroads, but they're going to be like a bit of a scary thing. That's like, this is the big thing. But yeah, I think it's going to be like a reverse National Front. That's just my opinion.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to ask you what you thought, Matthew. But yeah, Max, did you have any thoughts on what Matthew and Patrick have said? Max isn't there, I think. Audio issues. But yeah, so yeah, I mean, a news story from last week that I think didn't get as much coverage as some of these other stories was the junior doctors voting for continued strike action, and the ASLEV union voting for further strike action. Of course, inflation's still above 2.5%. Bank of England's frozen interest rates, but they're still pretty high. Patrick, do you think that some of these strikes are justified, and what should the government's response be? Should they try and strike a deal with them or not?
I think the junior doctors, they obviously have lost living standards over the past 15 years, in common with a lot of other people. We're a lot poorer as a country than we expected to be, just before the banking crash, which we've never really grown our way out of. So, and state finances are incredibly stretched, and the junior doctors do seem to be very militant. And I think the danger of this long term is that the way our health system is arranged, the national health system, a socialized national system, which has got great equity advantages. Nonetheless, it's kind of like it's a monopoly, and it's a monopoly in an essential good. And there's a tiny private healthcare system for people who can afford that. But when you have a monopoly and you have basically a closed shop trade union as well, it gives them enormous power to be able to shut down bits of the supply of the good or service. And it's a similar situation with ASLEF, although the actual rail infrastructure, the rail industry is not wholly nationalized or anything like that. But equally, again, they have that monopoly power to close down. If you have strikes and a group of workers at a biscuit factory in Reading decide that they want higher wages and conditions, they go on strike. Well, the biscuit eating world doesn't bat an eyelid. They just go and buy someone else's biscuits, right? So I think as someone who certainly I thought in the 80s and the 70s, trade union power was excessive and was caused massive economic damage, inflation, and actually was a boon to the strong over the weak, the highly unionized over the non-unionized. Then we've seen the pendulum swing a long way in the other direction in the private sector economy. We've had effectively a globalization of the workforce, both in terms of capital being able to sort of set up in other countries with cheaper labor, but also able to bring in cheaper labor in almost limitless quantities. So I think if you're working in the UK private sector in a working class occupation, you have very little bargaining power, and your living standards have certainly suffered because of that. But in parts of the public sector, ASLEF trained drivers are pretty well paid. If you look at another example, the London Underground, where the RMT has a closed shop monopoly, a tube driver is paid twice as much in London as a bus driver, and yet the bus driver's job is obviously massively more onerous and more skilled. You're not just pushing a pedal and pushing a brake. You're trying to get a huge vehicle around some roads that were built 200-300 years ago. In a rational world, the bus driver would earn twice as much as the tube driver. But it shows you the power of trade unions in monopolized sectors, and that isn't always going to bring a just result. And I fear that very long term, if the National Health Service is seen as a template for healthcare, which can get disrupted and closed down by almost rent-seeking trade union behaviour, then public support may start to die away. So I think the junior doctors on balance deserve a bit of an inflation busting pay deal. Of course they do, and probably it's just about affordable, and for the sake of morale and health service capacity and bringing down the backlogs, that needs to happen, but nothing like the level that they seem to, most junior doctors seem to think is their due. I think expectations are well out of kilter there, and no responsible government could exceed to 25 or 30% pay rises.
Yeah, thank you, Patrick. I think that's it's quite a balanced view. I was writing about this last week, but just for some context, the BMA have asked for a 35% pay rise due to the fact that their pay's been cut gradually over 15 years by 35%. And the NHS in Scotland managed to negotiate a pay deal of just over 12.5%, and that satisfied them. The government in England did not do the same, and now they're having to pay more to cover the strikes than they would have if they'd just done a deal. But yeah, Matthew, what do you think about what Patrick has said and the strikes in general?
Well, I think for essential services, such as like public transport and nursing and whatever, that there should be more avenues open for industrial action that isn't striking. For example, in Japan, bus drivers, if they go on strike, the buses keep running. They just refuse to accept the fares. So people basically get free bus things. So the public transport, it keeps on running, it keeps going, but it's not making any money. It's losing money. That's illegal in this country. I think that should be totally legal in this country because, for one, it would stop all the blooming transport workers going on strike all the blooming time. But also, even for, I mean, I can't think of anything specific, but there must be things that junior doctors can do instead of just outright striking. Like, I think. Again, I'm not terribly educated on this side of things, but I think firemen, when they go on strike, they don't actually go on strike. Like firemen keep on working, or fire brigade. Sorry, can't say firemen anymore. Fire people, they keep on working. They keep putting out fires, but there's something they do. I don't know the specifics, but the point is, I'm saying more avenues that isn't just strike action should be available that can, hurt what they're doing enough that they can justify demanding more pay, but they still are, saving lives and getting people from A to B and such, and what essential services do.
Plus, it also saves you a lot of money on train fares.
Yeah. I mean, one idea that I've always quite liked is workers on company boards, more workplace democracy. But I don't really know how that would work in the public sector. Patrick, do you think the public sector needs more reform in terms of more private involvement, or do you think that, I mean, I suppose the left would argue that you just need more private sector trade unions and you'd get rid of the restrictions on striking in the private sector?
Well, I certainly think the public sector needs more reform. Whether that's always going to be just by letting some sort of smart-ass private management consultants or profit maximizing private enterprises that's got a very checkered history in this country. I remember Labour's PFI deals, for instance, and I had a friend who worked in the city for a big investment bank who was negotiating on behalf of the private side of that with civil servants, and used to say they're complete pushovers. And actually, funnily enough, the main civil servant negotiating the PFI deals was Ollie Robbins, the man who was later to negotiate disastrously with the European Commission. And it was very much a case of you tell him to jump and he asks how high. So we've had some disastrous poor value for money out of some of private sector involvement in public services. We've also had failure to deliver basic service standards, which has meant, for instance, some train operating companies having to be taken over. So I think the British public is immensely sceptical, and probably rightly so, about kind of core national economic assets falling into private hands. The utility companies is another area which the consumer seems to be paying through the nose, and companies owned often in France or other European economies are making a killing. So private sector involvement, I'm not so sure, but in terms of reforming working practices to drive better productivity, there must be a huge capacity for that, because public sector productivity has completely been marooned, and is being exceeded by private sector productivity for year after year. And if we're going to get great public services again one day, we haven't got enough money being generated in our economy just to make that via hiring extra units, extra factors of production. We have to get more from what we've got. And I'm convinced huge public concerns like the NHS have got capacity for a lot of productivity increases, and in an ideal world the workers would get a share of that benefit themselves, but the overall service and the service users can get a benefit too. I'm hopeful, for instance, that Wes Streeting, might put his shoulder to the wheel on that stuff, and maybe will feel less constrained and more daring than a series of Conservative health secretaries have, because they know that the perception that they don't look after the NHS is a bit of an electoral killer. So they're walking on eggshells. Maybe Wes Streeting will be more rigorous and get better results.
Yeah, and Matthew, what do you think about that? Do you think there is more scope for reforming public services like healthcare? I mean, obviously, SDP policy for transport is nationalisation, but do you think that more state involvement would fix some of these problems?
Well, absolutely, absolutely, and the main problem, the reason this has all been happening is because of slashes and cuts and all this. It's I call it the cult of the GDP. The Tories especially, Labour to an extent, but not so much. But mainly the Tories are obsessed with the GDP. If an asteroid were about to hit Earth in about 2 days and wipe out all life, their first thought would be, "Oh my God, the GDP." And that's the thing, and they don't understand. They say if we need to build a new hospital, or this hospital is not fit for purpose, we need to knock it down and build a new one. And a Tory will go, the GDP isn't high enough for this. We can't afford to do this. But reforming that hospital or building a new hospital will in turn increase the GDP over time. It's basic Keynesian economics, and it's something that Tories just can't grasp. They look at just numbers. They look at numbers, and they don't care about what's actually happening. They're just looking at their little numbers, and it's a big bureaucratic issue that I think plagues the Tory party. And like I say, to an extent, Labour has it as well. Not nearly as bad, but to a smaller extent. And it is this cult of the GDP that is the problem.
Caring for the numbers more than the citizens and their well-being, which I think is one of the greatest crimes of the Tory government. I definitely agree with you there, Matthew.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and it's oh, sorry. And yeah, I agree with you somewhat that you need government investment for growth, but I think you've got to think also where's the growth going to? Is it going to the upper class, or is it going to the working class? And I think if you look at the strikes, generally I'm quite pro-worker. I think that trade unions have a purpose, but if it's just middle class public sector workers going on strike, I think it's quite sad if that's what the left has become about. But yeah, I mean, we're sort of coming towards the ending now of our podcast interview. So do either of you, starting with Patrick, do you have any final thoughts on what we've discussed?
Yeah, my kind of presiding thought in this phase of politics is that the establishment parties are not getting the extent of public disquiet, and the fact that living standards in this country haven't gone up basically for the best part of 20 years. And that's unprecedented since the Industrial Revolution. Like, something major has gone wrong with the globalized system. It's a bit like they used to say of foreign aid, that it's poor people in rich countries giving money to rich people in poor countries. Something akin to that has happened in the global economy. And so I can't remember who it was talking about the distributional, it might have been you, Samuel. The distributional impacts are very important. And if working class people are suffering, but people on FTSE boards are experiencing extremely large income increases, that was part of what led to Brexit, in the wake of the AA accession and the Labour government not putting on any transitional controls to the labour market. It was one of the greatest drivers of the huge working class support for leaving the European Union. But I just don't think the overall political class in Westminster is aware of the extent of potential public demand for something altogether new, something certainly more based around security, the nation state, citizen preference, If you look at the Tory approach to refugees and housing, Boris Johnson was signing blank checks to Hong Kong, to Ukraine, to a certain extent to Afghanistan, with no thought of where the extra housing provision was going to be. And you've now got pinch points all over the country where people in need of housing are finding out that Afghans and Ukrainians are being prioritized for the little bit of extra housing there is in their localities. And it's again putting sort of social solidarity, even race relations, flushing it down the loo. So I think there's a huge potential for a politics of belonging, of security, of the nation state, of citizen and compatriot preference to a moderate degree. No one wants to turn us into anything resembling a fascist entity. But there's a feeling that the globalization thing, it's been very good for people in poor countries in general. It's been very good for rich people in rich countries, but average people and lower income people in poor countries have been screwed over fully 2 decades and are aware of it and are angry about it. I don't think they see Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves as the obvious solution to that. But it explains the venom with which many of the former Conservative supporters now regard their party. And so to me, it's all about the space that's opened up and who fills it and how on the right of centre after the general election this year.
Thank you, Patrick. And Matthew, would you agree with what Patrick said? What are your final thoughts on today?
Oh yeah, I agree with Patrick 100%. And my final thoughts on sort of the state of what's going on is, as being a historian, I look back 100 years from now, back in the 1920s. We've just come out of a large-scale pandemic, the worst the world's ever seen. We've got a threat from the east. We've got an increasingly isolationist America, and most importantly, we've got one of the major establishment political parties of Britain being obliterated, essentially, and replaced with a new party, which obviously Liberal Party obliterated, replaced with the Labour Party. And I think we're going to see that now. I think we're going to see the Tory Party obliterated, and I think it could quite possibly be replaced, maybe by Reform, hopefully by the SDP. I guess we'll see. But I think, it's interesting to follow the timeline of events of the 1920s and see how they've coincided with the 2020s. But other than that, my sort of my last thing to say for this podcast would be, if anyone listening lives in Kettering, make sure to vote Matthew Murphy, SDP, in the general election.
Yeah, well, it's been really good having you both on, Matthew, Patrick. Thank you very much.